name's Tony Talbot, and I'm going to be talking about Andrew Watson, the world's first black football superstar. Now, today, if we look at the modern game of football, you would see a lot of black players. Very common, very normal. But this was not the case in the 1870s and the 1880s when Andrew Watson played. In fact, he was one of the very first black players to play the game of football, the modern game of football as we know it today. When most people talk about black football pioneers, they actually go to the period just at the start of the 20th century, and they focus a lot on Arthur Wharton or slightly later Walter Tull, who both played professional football and were definitely part of that pioneering movement of black footballers. However, very few people talk about the period of the 1870s and the 1880s. And because of that, they don't end up talking about Andrew Watson. So who exactly was Andrew Watson? Now, Andrew Watson was born in 1856 in Guyana, or British Guyana as it was then, and he died in London in 1921. His father, Peter Miller, was from Scotland, and his mother, Hannah, was a local black woman, and as I mentioned, he was born in Guyana. Now, when his father died, Andrew Watson was left with a sum of £35,000 in his will. So that was a lot of money. That was just over £3 million in today's currency if we were to convert it. He later came to England to settle in the mid-1860s and attended the Heath Grammar School in Yorkshire as well as King's College in London. Now, these were two very prestigious schools at the time, and this was where Andrew Watson went as a young boy and a young man. And this is where he lived in England. These were the two places he lived in England up to this period. The two schools that he went to, one part of their curriculum was sports. Now, this was very important in the Victorian period. Middle-class boys, privileged and the elite children were expected to take part in sports, especially rugby, cricket, and later football, amateur football. And so Andrew Watson was involved in a number of sports. And in 1874, he returned to Glasgow in Scotland. This is where his parents were from. So he went to Scotland, and in 1874, he joined the Park Grove Football Club and was captain of this club from 1874 until 1880. So what were some of Andrew Watson's major achievements? And I'm talking here about his football achievements. One, he was the captain of the Park Grove Football Club from 1874 till 1880. Not only was he the captain of this team, he was also their club secretary. Therefore, he's the first black player to captain a football team as well as being the club secretary of that football team. This would make him the world's first football administrator, and this is in the middle of the 1870s. He was also the club secretary of Queen's Park Football Club. Now, Queen's Park was the most prestigious football team in Scotland, in Britain, not just Scotland, at that time. So for Andrew Watson to be their club secretary as well when he joined them in the 1880s, that is another major achievement. So here's a black guy who was the captain of two football teams in Scotland, but Queen's Park is a major achievement because that was Scotland's most prominent amateur football club. He was also the first black player to win 3 cup final medals, also for Queen's Park. First black player to do that. He was also the first black player to play for a national football team when, in 1881, he played for Scotland. But he not only played for Scotland in England, in London in 1881, he also captained that Scottish national football team. So this would make him the world's first black football captain of a national team. That game in 1881, Scotland versus England, was also England's heaviest defeat on home soil. England lost that game 6-1. The captain of the team, Andrew Watson, a defender, left back, playing for Scotland against England in London, England's heaviest defeat on home soil. He was also the first black player to play for the English team, Corinthian FC of London. We played for them in 1880 when he actually joined that team. They handpicked him, selected him to play for them because of his overall brilliance. So not only was he a very good footballer, but he was someone who was in tremendous demand, both in Scotland, where he played, and also in England, where he would later come and play in the 1880s as well. Now, most people in Scotland today, they know of Glasgow Rangers, they know of Celtic. These are the two dominant football clubs that people know about. But in the 1870s and 1880s, when Andrew Watson played, the most prominent team was Queen's Park. Queen's Park dominated Scottish football right until the beginning of the 20th century. And it was from Queen's Park that they developed many of the rules of the modern game of football, with some of which would be passed into England. And in particular, Queen's Park developed a new way of playing football and a new formation. So unlike the English formation, which was based on 1-1-8, that is one defender, one midfield player and 8 attacking players or forwards, what Queen's Park developed was a different formation where they had 2 defenders, 2 or 3 midfield players and maybe 5 forwards. The other thing that they did that was developed in Scotland by Queen's Park Football Club was that they passed the ball. They, instead of playing a game based on individual power and dribbling, which is what was done in England, Queen's Park developed the passing game, or what was called combination football, a mixture of dribbling as well as passing the ball. This would transform the way the game of football was played. This is what Queen's Park did. And at the heart of this development was Andrew Watson, who was the club's secretary. For this reason, Queen's Park was able to dominate Scottish football from the 1870s, 80s and 90s. No other team in Scotland could beat them or outplay them. And it was because of how they played this particular game. Andrew Watson, when he came to England in the mid-1880s, early 1880s, he brought this style with him. And a number of Scottish footballers came south of the border to play football in England. And when they played football, they actually introduced this style or this approach. So this is why in the northern part of England, the English League was dominated by teams from the Midlands, such as Aston Villa and Preston North End. These were the dominant teams in English football in the 1880s, 90s and early 20th centuries. And what they were doing, they were playing this combination style of football that had been introduced from Scotland. And at the heart of this was Andrew Watson. He played a role in this modernizing aspect of the game of football. This helps to explain why in 1881 he was also selected to play for the Corinthian amateur football team in England, because they were fed up with Scotland constantly beating England in international football matches between the two countries. Why was this so? The way the Scottish teams played football. So what Corinthian football team wanted to do with their founder, N.J. Jackson, was that they wanted to create a game of football that was based on the kind of skill that they had seen in Scotland, but they didn't have the players to do it. So what they did, they imported a number of players who knew this style, and that's why Andrew Watson was selected from Scotland, Queen's Park, where he was playing at the time, to come and also play for Corinthian as an amateur footballer. And of course, that would make him the world's first footballer to play for England's famous amateur football teams. So Andrew Watson was not only a very good footballer who was in demand because of his skills and also because he knew how to play this combination style of football, which was in demand in England at the time, but he was also very educated. He went to very good schools and also attended the University of Glasgow, but he didn't complete his studies because in 1874 he stopped his studies to go and play football. So he was reasonably well educated. His father was a fairly rich white plantation owner. His father actually had 16 slaves and received about £800 compensation in 1834 and 1835 for selling, for the loss of his property as a result of the Emancipation Act of 1833. So Andrew Watson had money, he also had education, and he was also a very talented football player. So he was an administrator, the world's first black football administrator. He was also the world's first black investor in football. He actually played a role in helping Park Grove to get a piece of land to play their football. He was a national football team captain, and he won 3 National Cup medals. No other black player did this. No other black player achieved so much accomplishments in this early period. No other black player even played for Scotland till about 100 years later. So what Andrew Watson was doing in the 1870s and the 1880s was, in a sense, setting the kind of stages and steps that we see now for other black players to come in and fill much later. So it's in this sense that I'm saying that Andrew Watson was indeed the world's first black football superstar. If you need more information about Andrew Watson, then kindly look at the publication details that will be coming up shortly, and you can see how you can get yourself a copy of this book and help to spread the word about this very, very important early